Okay, well, let's get started. Thank you very much and welcome and good afternoon to all of you. My name is Gabi Schmiegel. I'm the Director of Sponsored Student Programs in International Student and Scholar Services, and I'd like to welcome you to the world's longest title on a PowerPoint slide, Supporting Higher Education Efforts in Post-Conflict Societies, What Role Can the U Play? I'm delighted to have two wonderful panelists. One is Meredith McQuaid, the Associate Vice President and Dean for International Programs for the Global Programs and Strategy Alliance, otherwise known as my boss's boss, and Mike Anderson, the Director of the Minnesota English Language Program. And basically, I was told always to tell the audience what we're going to talk about. And I'm going to talk about the first 2 points to set the stage for the presentation, to give some context, knowledge economy and global engagement, and then talking about post-conflict societies, Iraq and then Libya in question marks. And much of internationalization is driven by personal experiences. Either we know somebody who's a foreign or we are somebody who is foreign. And if we ever leave our country, we're foreigners. So this presentation also was driven by personal experience, namely my trips to Iraq and Libya in 2010 and 2011, and a conversation I had with Gail Woodruff. And she said I should make this a panel presentation, and I had problems saying no to her. The goal is basically to think about how the university or how we as individuals can engage in these in higher education efforts in those countries or even in other countries, an understanding of some of the barriers that these countries are facing, and then some of the rewards that we can reap if we engage with them. Part 2 is basically talking about a tangible example of some infrastructure improvements that we have made at the university, and Mike Anderson will talk about conditional admission on both the graduate and undergraduate level. And then basically Meredith will conclude this by giving us some examples of how to engage the university in post-conflict societies. And we're not presenting any answers necessarily, and so you may leave with more questions than answers. In my previous life, I was trying to get a PhD, so I did a lot of research, and I came across this quote: "At no time in human history was the welfare of nations so closely linked to the quality and outreach of their higher education systems and institutions." And I think this is very, very important when we think about internationalizing, not just this institution, but internationalizing higher education in general. In terms of the 21st century that we're in, it's characterized by a shift toward a global knowledge society, accelerating advances and developments in technology. When I was growing up, actually, until I came to the university in ~94, I had no idea of the internet. I'm originally from Germany. We're supposed to be tech savvy, but I wasn't. When I was growing up, we didn't have cell phones. They didn't exist. E-readers, all these technology advances that we have now, they're recent. Increasingly, when we look at the development policy literature, human capacity development is linked with the emerging global knowledge economy. And what knowledge economy means, or global knowledge economy means, is that education, knowledge, and innovative thinking become key currencies and key resources for the welfare of a particular nation or the globe. What we need to realize is that the gap between developed and developing countries widens across the knowledge divide in terms of access to knowledge, infrastructure for innovation, opportunities for participating in the global knowledge economy. And this becomes not just a problem for the people or the nations that cannot participate, but it also is an issue for us who are participants and who are key players in the global knowledge economy. The US higher education system, basically, when I travel around the world, is a key player in the global knowledge economy. What's always stressed is that we're very, very attractive as a receiver for international students, because our education system places a high value on the individual student, developing the individual. the professor isn't seen as the sole repository of information and knowledge, but rather it's the individual who can make their way through education. Research is stressed here in the US, innovation, and I know we have the slogan at the university, driven to discover. I would argue that discovery is only the first part of this equation, and that we can't just stop at discovery, but we have to go and move forward to innovation. So we should actually be having a little change in that topic and say driven to innovate. The focus, as also the university president mentioned, is here on lifelong learning. Universities are not just centers where we educate people to then be able to do a job, but we want to encourage graduates to be participants in lifelong learning and innovation, and in having a joy in widening their horizons, not just once they get their diploma that everything is over. The University of Minnesota, basically, we should pat ourselves on the back, is perfectly positioned as a key catalyst for knowledge creation. Significant advances, significant wonderful things have happened here on campus. And we are already globally engaged. So big pat on the back on our end. This is all great. However, I would argue that we need to do a little bit more. Because what we are up to, or what we need to engage with, is post-conflict societies. They're characterized oftentimes by societal fragmentation. When the central government collapses, schisms in society erupt, and there is a conflict about resources, power, and the rebuilding efforts have to center on giving people an equal voice in the new society. The need to rebuild the country, develop human capacity, and to build up a scientific infrastructure that may have either never existed or that may have been devastated by years of war. Isolation from the global academic community, which I'll illustrate in the two examples of Iraq and Libya, has to be overcome. Research has to be restarted, and then the scientific collaboration basically has been lagging for decades often. They're lagging behind, and it's not about just catching up. Because if we're looking at just catching up, we're always going to be ahead, they're always going to be somewhere at the bottom. But what I would argue is that we have to help them leapfrog, or they have to have the ability to leapfrog across obstacles. Post-conflict societies are often characterized by a huge youth bulge, where the overwhelming majority of the population is under the age of 30. And what I've realized in my travels is that these, especially Libya and Iraq, have a huge commitment to change, to move forward, to overcome the past, and to actually be able to move into the 21st century. Now, internationalization efforts in higher education in these two countries basically are characterized by two connected aspects. They have ambitious scholarship programs to promote the education of future leaders by going abroad and returning to make significant contributions to their society, and by increased efforts to collaborate with foreign, for example, US, but also UK and Australian universities as equals. And I want to stress the as equals because it's not about Western academic imperialism. We should not be engaging in order to say we know everything, you know nothing, and so now adopt what we're telling you to adopt. What the efforts should be looking toward are mutual benefits. What benefit can we give to the universities, to the higher education efforts, and what can we gain from them as a benefit for us? Those efforts have to be characterized by cultural and professional sensitivity, not just, as I said, blanket adoption of the US curriculum, but also adaptation of curriculum to local situations. The theme that I heard when I was in meetings with ministry officials, with university presidents, with deans, with professors, was basically collaborative research projects, joint PhD supervision, for example, faculty development, faculty exchange, and curriculum development and network there is a thirst for having an interaction with another human being in the same field of studies. In October 2011, I was invited by both the Institute of International Education as well as the US Embassy in Iraq. The US Embassy in Iraq has seen an increase in questions and inquiries for prospective students wanting to come, especially to the University of Minnesota. So they asked us to participate in the first higher education fair in Erbil in Kurdistan, or actually politically correcter would be the Kurdistan regional, the Kurdistan region of Iraq, because it's not an independent country. We had meetings with ministries of the, with representatives of the Ministry of Education and Higher Education, both of the central government in Iraq and the Kurdish side, university representatives, and members of parliament. So this was quite a big deal. In the two-day fair that we had in Erbil, which is the capital of the Kurdish region, we had 1,400 students, prospective students and students in Iraq that attended, and many were from other regions in Iraq, which was seen as a huge success because there are tremendous, tremendous difficulties for mobility in that country right now. What we learned was that only 2% of Iraqis right now have access to computers in their workplace. Just think of what that means for the infrastructure of higher education. The education experience basically is rigid, teacher-centered, which is nothing too new for anyone who has been to the Middle East. It's not anything significant. It's a limited study abroad since the 1960s, basically. So the university's professors that have studied at Iraqi universities before they became professors were already educated by professors who had never been abroad. So we have the third or fourth generation of university students that haven't had any exposure to anybody who has studied abroad. ESL capacity is very limited. Standardized tests are an issue, both in terms of access, availability, and then also about personal safety. Depending on where the test is offered, may not necessarily be where the student can travel due to religious, ethnic boundaries, and so they have to weigh that. And when you think about taking the GRE, which is a requirement for about 3/4 of our graduate programs, in the whole country, only 50 people took the GRE in Iraq in 2010. There are no credit cards, which some might think is a bonus. However, when a student wants to apply to the University of Minnesota, we have a wonderful application system, apply yourself, and you cannot submit your application until you pay with a credit card. If you want to get a US visa, you have to pay the CVIS fee with a credit card, and so on and so forth. The bandwidth of the internet is very, very low, so they can't download big PDFs. So even if we were to send educational materials via the internet to Iraq, in terms of providing them with textbooks, they can't download big PDFs. And the consul, the U.S. consul who works in the non-immigrant visa section at the U.S. Embassy in Iraq has actually told me personally that he was sitting with an Iraqi applicant for a U.S. student visa one day to try and fill out the online U.S. student visa application. It's all very nice and very well, except it took them 7 hours to fill out that online form because the internet crashed. So there are some significant infrastructure barriers, and still people do want to come to the United States, and they do want to come to the University of Minnesota. Kurdistan, we were told to be very, very mindful of the fact that this was taking place in Kurdistan and not in Baghdad, because Baghdad isn't considered basically the way from the airport to wherever you go in the green zone isn't safe. And then when you're inside the green zone, you can't move. So Kurdistan, which leads to a lot of resentment within the Iraqi population, The Kurdish region is considered to be more secure. They have been under the no-fly zone, and so they were very much more developed than the rest of Iraq. Even while Saddam Hussein was still in power, they were protected by the Western governments. Tribal, religious affiliation, and ethnic group affiliations impact where Iraqis can go within Iraq. The other thing that happened with the most recent war in Iraq is that the large amount, if not 90% of the professional, middle class, educated people left the country. Doctors, teachers, medical professionals. So all of that has to be rebuilt. And when we think about Iraq, there was a war, 1980 to 1988, the Iran-Iraq War, the first Gulf War actually. 1990 to 91, so 2 years later, the first US and Western war with Iraq. And then from 2003 onwards, another war. And what that has done to the population, to the infrastructure there. US visa applications are only possible at the US Embassy in Iraq, which is inside the green zone. When people are there, they have to wait for several hours in what's called the Meadowlands, which is outside the safe zone, the green zone. And there have been quite a lot of attacks on people in that area. Once something happens there, nobody can help these people. The Americans are not allowed to leave the embassy. Nobody else can leave, can go from the Meadowlands anywhere. So it's very, very difficult for them to actually apply for a visa. And still, they go and apply for a visa because they want to come to the US and study here. University presidents and teaching staff have been targets for assassinations in Iraq. And the mailing system isn't just unreliable, but sending an actual letter through the postal system to Iraq puts a target on that person's and that family's back. So any kind of correspondence that needs to be sent to Iraq can only be sent by courier mail. So, despite all of that, there is still good news. The Iraqi Education Initiative intends to send 10,000 students per year abroad. Many of them are supposed to come to the US, and they're all fully funded. It's a slow process, of course, because when you look at 2009, 2010, there were about 400 students in the US, 2010, 11, 600. However, at the University of Minnesota, none. And the experience here is that after I came back from the trip, I talked to many, many departments, and the experience here has been that I hear no. No, it's past the deadline, we don't want to set a precedent. No, we don't want to consider conditional admission because it might give an unfair advantage to this student as opposed to another student. No, these students don't look like other students that we get from China. And no, we don't know anything about the university in Iraq that sends the student, so we don't feel comfortable with the credentials, and we don't think the student is actually a valid applicant to our institution. So when the US Embassy in Iraq forwards me dossiers of students to place here, and then I go back and say, well, oops, no, the deadline was passed, or no, they don't know anything about that university. How will you know anything about that university if you don't engage? There's an overhaul of the entire education system in Iraq, from pre-kindergarten to elementary to high school to the college system. The intent is to raise the level of higher education to meet international standards, and they need help, and they want help, but they want help to be of mutual benefit, so they also want to give something back to the institution that helps them. Now, Libya, maybe not necessarily a post-conflict society, but it has a lot of the same kind of characteristics, has a scholarship program. 2008, 2009, about 1,000 students in the US, 2010, 1,500, and we have actually Libyan students at the University of Minnesota, which is great. I talked about the youth bulge. If you look at Libya, the population is about 6.4 million, and 73% of that population are under the age of 30. and they do need education. ESL, English, learning English, having anything to do with English, having an English newspaper, having anything scribbled in English, was prohibited for almost 30 years. And the country has been, up until recently, quite isolated. I did participate on behalf of the university at the first higher education fair in Tripoli, also organized by the US Embassy in Tripoli in 2010. And at the two-day fair there, we met about 8,000 students. So the 450 fact sheets that I had printed out for the university, they were basically gone in like 5 minutes. I can't tell you how many times I've heard of stories where people were admitted to the university in 1981 with full funding, and then due to the sanctions, they couldn't come. So the stories of having their education be interrupted due to political circumstances that were outside of their control were really, really heartbreaking and too numerous to count. The themes, both Iraq and Libya and many, many other countries, are a dire wish or a need for university or department linkages, and something called conditional admission, which is what Mike will talk about in a second. So thank you very much. And I will hand it over to Mike.
I thank Gabby for inviting me to come and talk today. We've actually talked about conditional admission to graduate programs this fall. The graduate school graciously invited us to talk about the possibilities of conditional admission. We devised a little dog and pony show and talked about it with many different departments. So I'm going to give you a little bit of background on what we can do in terms of conditional admissions today, and maybe possibilities of what we may want to do in the future. And I'm going to ask Gabby to chime in on some things that she may be able to speak to better than I can. So we'll talk a little bit about what is conditional admission, how it works, who bears the burden of conditional admission, so kind of taking the responsibility for where the student is at different parts of their academic career, why we would want to offer it, and other things to consider. So what is conditional admission? So basically, it's one of those students, possibly from Iraq or Libya, that would be applying to the university. But other groups that apply for conditional admission would be students through the Fulbright organization often, and other fully funded students that are usually funded through their home country's government. A student applies for admission for a certain term, and I'm going to focus on graduate school today, so I'm talking about graduate school admission, and at the end I'll talk a little bit about undergraduate admission that parallels this too. And what would happen would be the department would review the application for the student, setting English aside, so saying, okay, if they get their English up to where it needs to be, would this student be a good candidate for our program? And then if the student is, they would admit that student conditionally by giving them a letter that says, if you come and work on your English and improve it up to our required minimum, then you'll be able to start the program. So how does that work? Well, students usually get up to get a year of time to work on their English before they start their graduate or undergraduate program. So they are fully funded for that year of English in addition to their academic degree program that would come after that. Some scholarship organizations are willing to look at even more than a year of English training if they feel it's worth investing in that student. If the students meet the English requirement by the time they need to be admitted to their degree program, great. Unfortunately, there are times when students, for various reasons beyond the control of the student, even sometimes there are family issues or other issues, they're not able to focus on their studies and they don't reach that minimum in time. In that case, the student would not matriculate into the degree program, and that does happen sometimes too. And we always try to stress, Gabby and I, when we go around, that we are in no way advocating that any program lowers their standards for admission. Rather, conditional admission is a way for giving some flexibility to students who know that they need to improve their English, but that otherwise they're a great candidate for that program and may bring perspectives to that program that would not otherwise be in that student body because of the background that they come from. So who does this student, where does this student belong? Maybe where is better than who here. So when a student is conditionally admitted, they just receive a letter from the department and grad admissions office or undergraduate admissions that says you will be admitted if you get here and get your English up to this point. So in that sense, students don't actually matriculate and they don't count in departmental statistics or years towards graduation until they actually begin their degree program. Before that, when they arrive, they're actually a student in a continuing education non-degree student at the Minnesota English Language Program. So their purpose is to study English here and for that period of time before they matriculate to their program. So why would we want to do this? Because it's more work. It doesn't necessarily fit into the timetable, as Gabby said, for admissions for all programs. Well, it can help programs diversify their student body and attract highly qualified international students from underrepresented countries. Conditional admission is a big issue out there and something that organizations, it's often the first thing they ask about. And if we say, well, for this program, they won't consider conditional admission, they're not going to consider the University of Minnesota because there are lots of other programs out there that will build in some flexibility for conditional admission. So this is a big trend that's out there the reason that scholarship organizations are so concerned about that is they don't want to send a student someplace and then find out later that they're not academically qualified to continue on at that institution. They want to work with institutions to send qualified applicants that are going to be successful at that institution, that can settle down and spend the time improving their English and getting up to speed. Culturally as well as settling in. Some candidates, as Gabby pointed out, can't access test centers, so they may not be able to take some of the standardized tests like a TOEFL test before they apply. So that's an issue that still sometimes needs to be worked out, and it's sometimes the GREs that they can't take as well. Government-funded students are typically high-performing students that are in the top percentage of their either undergraduate or high school classes. And as I said, many scholarship organizations are only willing to allow students to come if they're conditionally admitted to a degree program before they come. Some advantages are students can study at MELP before beginning their degree program, helps them culturally adjust so they can more hit the ground running when they start their degree program. all of our students are come to the English program it's the first time that they're coming to study at a institution of higher education in the U.S. often. So we work with familiarizing them with the resources on campus, the U.S. educational system, the culture as well. So it's an opportunity for students to do that, as well as if students are conditionally admitted, we can connect them with their degree programs so they can start getting to know faculty and staff in that program before they get to the point where they're ready to start the program. So some things to consider, too, with conditional admission. One is English proficiency and the amount of time that a student would be allowed to study English. Preferably, especially for graduate programs, if a student really has zero English, the probability that they would get up to a graduate level of English within 1 year is unlikely. So they would probably need more time to do that. So we'd generally be looking for students with some English ability if they only have a year. If scholarship organizations are willing to let students study 2 years, then there's a little bit more flexibility. But we have some recommendation levels of if students are able to take a TOEFL test or an IELTS test while they're in country, and this may not apply to all Iraqi and Libyan students, but we have some suggested ranges where if a student's within this range, they'd be likely to get to this point within a year. If your TOEFL minimum is higher than the general university minimum, you'd probably want a student at another range. What we usually stress is just communicating with the students so that they're not put in a situation that is an impossible situation for them, so that the expectations are so high that they actually can't meet those. They only have 6 months to improve their English. But if you can have a conversation with a scholarship organization beforehand and negotiate some of those conditions, it's sometimes possible that everyone has a better understanding before the student comes. Funding covers ESL, but also will sometimes cover the student taking the GRE or GMAT or LSAT when they arrive in the United States. So sometimes that's covered in scholarships as well. We'll want to think about support for these students because there's often post-traumatic stress or interrupted schooling. So there are additional supports that are needed for students that come from post-conflict countries. Sometimes there's strong home country support systems in Minnesota. So, for example, we have some Libyan students at the university already. I know that when the Libyan conflict started and we had Libyan students here, that we could, often they helped each other out. They were very willing to help new students coming in adjust to life in the United States. So that's a resource too once we get some students here and a growing community that, that will also support other students. And peer institutions have already had some of these students. And Gabby, maybe you want to say just a word about peer institutions? Okay. My last slide is just resources. So for graduate and undergraduate conditional admissions, there's some resources on the graduate school website or some more information about our undergraduate conditional admission process on the Twin Cities campus. The Minnesota English Language Program currently works with the Twin Cities campus, the Duluth campus, and the Crookston campus with articulated conditional admissions for undergraduate students. There are some limitations and some variations between those agreements and what we're able to do, But there are some agreements that are already out there, too.
Okay, well, I'm the part of the program that was mentioned last in the paragraph, and that is you will leave with more questions than answers. I don't really have anything quite as definitive or helpful as Gabi and Mike have, because I think part of the reason I was asked to be on this panel is being a senior administrator at the University of Minnesota, I ought to be able to explain how we can do better in responding to post-conflict countries and students there. And so I have questions for you. Really, hearing this, first of all, I want to say that I am Gabi's boss's boss, and I wish I was Mike Anderson's boss. But both Gabi and Mike do a lot to advance the university's reputation around the world and to bring students here who wouldn't otherwise have the chance. It used to be easier, at least I've been around the university a very long time, and there was a time when we had a lot of tuition waivers available. We sort of went out of our way to attract and support students from post-conflict countries, and generally countries who were of such developing conditions that there was no way they could get here on their own. In part because of the economic situation that has sort of turned our situation around, and personally I think in part because we've lost our advocacy efforts. We just don't do it anymore. Gabi's right. She comes back from these countries where she's able to articulate very well why these students can't apply, can't get out, but if they could get some help, we could get them here. And we can't get colleges to do it. And I just want to stress, I see a lot of my staff in the room today, but I see a lot of coordinate campus people here and some from other colleges. We have got to push this issue at the University of Minnesota. For all the good that we do, for all the bragging that we do, for all the wonderful things we can say about how we internationalize, we are failing in this regard. And we are not fully internationalizing if we don't bring a vast, a much larger representation of the world's populations than we do currently. I think that it is a university-wide conversation. What do we mean when we say we are internationalizing? And who does that include and who doesn't it include? And if it costs us money and then we're not going to do it? So and I can only say so much. I mean, I say I'm only one, and I'm with the same people all the time, and they get tired of my voice. But it's the faculty, it's the deans, it's the chancellors that really need to be asked, do you want to have representation here from people around the world, from people who come from different backgrounds and different religions, who are experiencing post-conflict trauma and need access to education, or do you not? And if they don't, then let's have them say it. And if they do, then we have to find the resources to do it. I just want to say I read an article in the Chronicle the other day, and I did tweet about it if anybody saw the link. Since 2007, there's been a couple in Syria that have been running the Iraqi Student Project. They run it on his Social Security check. And it is a nonprofit agency founded by the couple. They brought 47 student refugees in Syria. So there's Iraqi refugees in Syria. That's who this couple is dealing with. Many of these refugees have fled sectarian violence and other strife, and they have gotten these 47 students to 35 colleges in the United States. 8 are preparing to make the trip next, depending on whether they can get out now, because things in Syria are pretty dire. They operate out of their apartment in downtown Damascus, and they were interviewed by this Chronicle reporter, and they were asked, has the uncertain economy in the United States affected the financial assistance colleges are willing to offer? And what they say is that 2 years ago was the worst for tuition waivers. Everybody was saying, not this year, we can't do it. Last year was better, and this year they just say it's too early to tell. Tuition waivers are what they say. The college doesn't get the tuition for the student. But we have all kinds of scholarships that colleges offer. I mean, that just, not having a tuition waiver isn't an acceptable answer to me. Other colleges are doing it. And they say, what do you tell admissions officers who may be skeptical about how well Iraqi students can do in an American college? One of Gabi's points. And they say, we've got students at Dartmouth, we've got students at Wellesley, we've got students at the University of Oregon, and we're serious that we have students who can compete. So I just bring that up to say the demand is there, the services are there, and the University of Minnesota really should find a way to step up if we are serious about internationalizing, and if we're serious about wanting to make a difference in the world, and I don't mean change, make a change in places, I mean make a difference. So it's not, again, Gabi said, it's not about imposing our system. It's about giving people access to opportunities that can empower them to make change. I think that there are questions of, can we get students here for degree programs? Should we look at more non-degree programs for bringing students in, working with other agencies that bring students in, so that we provide inspiration and motivation for further study? We can bring programs to them. I think that can often be a way to internationalize our faculty, for example, to travel to their countries and do maybe some college prep courses or just general education services. I also want to recommend this concept of targeting women in these post-conflict societies. I just want to cite to some testimony by Isabel Coleman she gave before the Congressional Human Rights Caucus a few years ago. And she said that economists increasingly recognize that nothing is more central to development than the economic, political, and social participation and leadership of women. This is particularly true in post-conflict societies, where women often make up the majority of the population and have primary responsibility for raising the next generation. A broad set of data now show that raising female education, increasing their control over resources, and lifting their political voice can have a profound impact on development. So that's my part of the program. I don't have anything to say specifically other than I need your help. If you're here, I assume you're here because you care about what's going on in post-conflict countries, and I assume that you care about comprehensively internationalizing the University of Minnesota. And so we really need your voice. We need people to ask more questions about why we're not serving this population and to come up with ways that we can. So we have a few minutes left, and we'll just open it up to questions.
Hi, my name's Heather Ring. I'm a graduate of a conflict studies program from the Catholic University Leuven. This is a Belgian program, much like many of the programs you see in Northern Europe, that are international higher education programs which bring and specifically target actually students from developing countries. In fact, they don't enjoy taking many Americans, so because we're too Western and too, I suppose, just bland. With regards to this particular program, it was an amazing educational opportunity. The reason I bring it up is because we are clearly behind Northern Europe in this offering. And what I've heard today and what Dean McQuaid reiterated was we've talked a lot about barriers, but these are barriers we've imposed that we're asking a group that has no ability to overcome these barriers to do it anyway. And President Kaler has made two things of many very clear in his statements about what he wants to do. We are too risk adverse. I couldn't agree more. And number two, he says access and excellence. And we're only looking at excellence here, assuming that these kids cannot reach that level. So I would love to be an advocate for this, but I would love to hear what we have to say about putting our money where our mouth is on this and how this does not take away from our student population or simply decrease our educational level when you see premier institutions doing this.
Yeah, we also had an Iraqi medical fellow one year. He had come here on a Fulbright scholarship. He had married an American girl. He had a heck of a time trying to convince the U.S. government that he wouldn't get killed if he went back home. So he was able to get asylum and to remain here. But my question is, how can we do this if the government is not allowing Iraqis in? They promised so many Iraqis who worked with the U.S. government the access to be able to come to the U.S., and it's only a trickle that are being allowed in.
Yeah. Well, that is a problem, and that's consistently been voiced to the U.S. government, even when I was in Iraq. The difference is, I mean, the UK is just as concerned about national security and terrorism as the US. However, the UK does not require a personal appearance when you make a visa in order to have the visa processed, whereas the US requires people to stand in line and possibly be shot in the Meadowlands before they even get to the embassy. So yes, but one of the things that the US government has been looking at is establishing a consulate with visa capabilities in Erbil in the Kurdish region, and also to facilitate the issuance of visas. For example, they have a mechanism in place where students can apply for the visa with a scanned copy of their I-20 or DS-2019, so they don't have to go to the embassy twice. And so that it's supposed to be helpful. But yes, that problem is consistently a problem, and it also explains why when they want to send 10,000 students abroad, the US only has 620 something. But the thing, and I have to say I love you right now. Oh, yes.
And I also philanthropy. So I work in development now in my current position. So really, you're talking about funding. You're right. There's funding. Why can't those scholarships go to
Right.
And the sad part of this is there is funding. These students are all going to be fully funded by the Iraqi government. They're not looking for funding.
Right.
But I have had interactions with deans and department heads. Now, I always think that people that have a PhD can somewhat think, or can at least read. But to be very honest, maybe it's because I'm a non-native speaker of the English language there, but I outlined this to a department head and to a dean, and said, here's a student that's really well qualified and blah, 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 and, would you consider conditional admission, and this is what it would mean. And the answer I got back was, well, if the Iraqis can't speak English, they shouldn't be in the sciences. And I'm like, have you read my email? So I couldn't even respond. To be honest, I couldn't even respond to that email for 3 days, because any response that I would have fired off, I would not be sitting here anymore. But to be honest, it's easy to say no. It's so easy to say no. And I understand that there is fear of the unknown, and there is, rankings and ratings and whatnot. But why not just have, overcome the fears, just once take a chance on a student and see what happens. And 9 times out of 10, there will be a positive outcome. Yes? Sorry.
We're over time.
I think we're over time. I'm so sorry, but thank you so much. And let's continue the conversation.
Thank you.